Have you ever imagined being humiliated in front of hundreds of people, right in the middle of a church pulpit, and then discovering that the same person who preached about fidelity and holiness was betraying you in your own home? My name is Lisa Campbell. I'm 50 years old, and today I want to open my heart and share a part of my life that I never thought I'd share publicly. But I know that perhaps my story also reflects yours, or that of someone very close to you. Behind the smiles, the neat clothes, and the beautiful words at the altar, there was a pain no one saw. I was the devoted wife, the woman who prayed, who supported, who believed in marriage as God's purpose. But little by little, I was silenced, judged, and exposed in ways only those who have experienced it can understand. Do you recognize yourself in this experience? It wasn't just the betrayal that shattered me. It was the public exposure, the humiliation before the congregation, the feeling of being alone amid so many voices that should have defended me but chose silence. I asked myself, how is it possible that within faith, the place that should have been one of healing and acceptance had become the stage for my greatest pain? And when the truth finally came to light, the betrayal no one could have imagined, the broken trust within the home, I found myself facing an abyss. Shame, judgment, and loneliness became my daily companions. I know I'm not alone. Many Christian women have faced betrayal, abandonment, and humiliation, but few have the courage to speak out. Trust me, the end is worth it. What I'm about to share may not only touch your heart, but also change the way you view your own journey. The following may change your perspective on what it means to survive the deepest pain. And it was at that point in my life, when I thought there was no way out, that something unexpected happened. You might think this only happens to other women, but I was the wife of a church leader, and everything seemed perfect. From the outside, we were the model couple. He with his firm posture, his convincing way of preaching, and I, always smiling beside him, supporting him every step of the way. But behind the scenes, there was a backdrop of silence, swallowed tears, and words that never came out of my mouth. The hidden truth was that I no longer had room to be who I was. My identity was fading, little by little, as I tried to uphold the image others expected of me. The mindset I carried was simple. If I am faithful. If I keep quiet, God will transform everything. I believed that each particular humiliation was just a phase that would soon pass. But the impact of these small pains accumulated like a tide that slowly invades the sand and washes away what seemed firm. Every meeting, every look, every harsh sentence left an invisible mark. Do you recognize yourself in this kind of journey? The one where the whole world sees the light, but you carry shadows inside? I vividly remember the first time. I realized something was wrong. It wasn't a scream or an argument, but that heavy silence that fills the air when love is no longer there. And yet, I persisted, because the decision to give up seemed impossible for someone who grew up believing that marriage is forever, no matter the cost. But no one talks about the price of losing yourself in this attempt to keep up appearances. Over time, I realized it wasn't just a matter of marital relationships. It was about identity, about courage, about how much we're willing to remain silent to sustain something that only exists on the surface. The cruelest thing was that, while I was fragmenting inside, outside, he was exalted as an example of faith and leadership. And this contradiction gnawed at me, like a wound that refused to heal. But there's something even more essential here, something few realize. When the truth finally comes out, it's not just trust in each other that crumbles. It's as if the entire structure you believed was secure, family, church, community, begins to shake along with it. And it's at this point that the story takes an unexpected turn, because what I discovered changed not only my marriage, but the way I view life, faith, and most importantly, myself. I was born and raised in faith, always serving, always believing in love and marriage as a sacred covenant. Since I was little, my most vivid memories are of the church pews, the music echoing down the aisles, the Bible stories I listened to with shining eyes. For me, all of this wasn't just a tradition, it was a calling. I believed that living according to the principles of faith was the noblest decision anyone could make. And for a long time, this mindset was my guide, my compass in every choice I made. In my youth, I watched the older couples in the congregation and thought, one day I'll have that too. Unity, complicity, unwavering love. Faith taught me that marriage isn't just a decision between two people, but a covenant before God. This truth seemed immutable, as if it were impossible to break. And when I met Mark, everything in me believed he was the answer to my prayers. He spoke eloquently, possessed presence, and everyone around him saw him as an example of spiritual leadership. I felt chosen, as if I had found the man who would walk with me through every stage of life. At first, this journey seemed perfect. I served alongside him, participated in projects, visited families, and together we were welcomed as if we were one heart. This image, this recognition, brought pride, but it also generated a silent pressure. There was a constant expectation that we be the impeccable couple, without flaws, without arguments, without weaknesses. And little by little, I realized my voice was disappearing behind the role imposed on me. The impact of this was not immediate, but over time, it began to corrode my essence. The most contradictory thing is that I truly believed I was on the right path. After all, anyone who grew up in faith knows how difficult it is to question something that has always been taught as absolute. I didn't yet see the cracks. Everything I did was justifiable in my head. It's just a phase. God is shaping me. I need to be patient. And so, amidst silences and hidden tears, I continued. Because for me, marriage was more than a commitment. It was part of my identity. But hidden truths that remain hidden sooner or later find a way to surface. I just didn't imagine that, in my case, the revelation would come so harshly and publicly, challenging not only my trust in my husband, but also the very fabric of faith I'd built as the foundation of my life. And it was precisely at this point that my journey began to change irreversibly, opening the way for pain I'd never considered facing, but also for a transformation I couldn't postpone. When I think about all this, I know I'm not alone. Many women carry similar wounds, but few find a safe space to talk about them. That's why I decided to open my heart here, because I believe real stories have the power to generate transformation, to awaken courage, and to show that we don't need to live trapped in silence. If this topic resonates with you, if what I'm sharing somehow touches your heart, I ask that you like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear this kind of message. Each like is a way of saying, I also believe this conversation matters, and it helps us build a community where no one needs to feel invisible. And as I share this part of my journey, I want you to know that there are still revelations that have completely changed the way I view not only marriage, but life, faith, and even myself. Because when the mask falls and the truth comes out, it's impossible to remain the same person as before. When I married Mark, I believed with all my heart that I had found the man God had in store for me. I remember the sparkle in everyone's eyes on our wedding day, the smiles, the hugs, and the words that told me we were a blessed couple, made to set an example for future generations. I felt like the happiest woman in the world, convinced that I had taken the most important step of my life toward a solid, secure, and purposeful future. That moment represented not only the fulfillment of a dream, but also the confirmation of a mindset I'd carried since childhood, that if we remained faithful, nothing could shake our union. The first few years were exactly as I'd hoped. Living together took its toll, like any journey together, but there was a seeming harmony, a routine that held us together. He, with his firm presence, his eloquent speech, his leadership position within the church. I, with my dedication, my constant support, my silence when I felt I shouldn't contradict. Together, we formed the perfect image of a solid marriage, a portrait that inspired others. Behind the scenes, however, details began to reveal themselves that, at the time, I didn't want to see. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like small cracks in a seemingly solid wall. Harsh words disguised as advice. Actions that sounded like oversights but silently hurt me. The impact of this didn't immediately shake me because I clung to the idea that every relationship goes through challenges and that my role was to be resilient. The problem is that in trying to maintain that image of perfection, I didn't realize I was stifling my own voice. I believed I was making decisions of love and faith, but in reality, I was giving up parts of myself for the sake of appearance. Even so, I kept telling myself, this is the dream wedding. It's just a phase. It will pass. The mentality of keeping up appearances was so strong that I preferred to ignore the signs rather than face the hidden truth that was beginning to reveal itself. And at that moment, I didn't know that every choice to remain silent, every tear held back, was leading me to a painful revelation that would completely change the course of my story. He was respected, preached with authority, had a presence that filled the eyes of those who listened to him, and seemed to carry with him an unshakable confidence. On Sundays, his every word was received as absolute truth, and the congregation saw him almost as an untouchable example of faith and leadership. I was always there, sitting in the front row, following his every gesture, every sermon, every smile, as if we were two parts of the same body. To everyone, I was the devoted wife, the submissive woman, the faithful companion who supported his calling and reinforced the image of a solid and admirable family. The curious thing is that in a way, I also believed in this construction. The impact of seeing so many people inspired by him made me think that every sacrifice was worth it, that my silence and my renunciations were small compared to the great mission God had entrusted to our marriage. I had a very strong mindset that being the wife of a leader required giving up my own desires, my feelings, even my limits. And I did this with a certain pride, because they applauded our union, because they held us up as a reference, because I believed it was proof that we were on the right path. But behind the scenes, the hidden truth was manifesting itself in small cracks. I realized he constantly needed to reinforce his authority, not only in front of the church but also at home. It was as if the pulpit extended into the living room, and I was just another part of the audience, expected to nod and applaud. I no longer knew where the preacher ended, and the husband who had promised me care and complicity began. This confusion between roles was suffocating me, because I was no longer Lisa, the woman with dreams and a voice, and was becoming simply the pastor's wife. The impact this had on my identity was profound. I saw myself smiling in photos, receiving compliments, but inside, I felt increasingly distant from who I truly was. The appearance of perfection weighed on my shoulders like a beautiful armor on the outside, but suffocating on the inside. It was hard to admit, but there was no longer any authenticity. And this contradiction between my public image and my hidden reality created a silent abyss that grew larger by the day. And it was precisely in this space of silence that signs of something I would never have dared to imagine began to emerge. But gradually, I realized my voice wasn't welcome. It was as if, without realizing it, I'd stopped being an active part of the story and become merely a decorative detail in his life. Whenever I tried to speak, whether at a church meeting or even in more intimate conversations at home, he'd cut me off, interrupt my sentences, and present his opinions as if they were absolute truths. With each interruption, I learned that my space was shrinking. At first, I thought it was simply the intensity of his way of expressing himself, but over time, I realized there was something deeper at work, a constant need to silence myself, to reduce myself, to erase any possibility of questioning. The impact of this was silently accumulating. It wasn't an overnight explosion, but a sequence of small moments that, together, began to erode my self-esteem. It's as if every time my voice was muffled, a piece of me was ripped away, until only a shadow of who I was remained. And the cruelest thing is that it all happened in front of other people, as if it were normal, as if it were natural that the leader's wife had no room to express her opinion, only to agree. This mindset trapped me in a painful cycle, because I convinced myself that being discreet and silent was a sign of wisdom and submission, virtues so exalted in the religious environment I grew up in. But within me, there was a growing conflict, a struggle between the woman who believed in the purpose of faith and the woman who felt suffocated behind the scenes of her own life. The hidden truth was that I was losing myself, And this realization hurt because I didn't want to admit to myself that this marriage, which seemed so solid, was, in practice, becoming an emotional prison. The revelations came slowly, almost like whispers. A meeting where he mocked a comment I made in front of other members. A pastoral visit where he interrupted me with a dry laugh, rendering my words meaningless. Small gestures that, to outsiders, might seem trivial, but to me had a devastating impact. It was confirmation that my place was not beside him as a partner, but behind him as a shadow. And I carried this pain alone, without the courage to talk to anyone. After all, who would believe him? Who would dare question the image of perfection he portrayed before the church? This contradiction between public and private tore me apart. I smiled in the photos, but cried in the silence of my room. I agreed to meetings, but alone, I wondered how much longer I could endure. It was as if my journey had been hijacked by a narrative that was no longer mine. And it was exactly in this context, in the midst of this silent struggle, that something happened that I will never forget. An episode that not only reinforced my silencing, but that cruelly exposed the abyss that was already forming within my marriage. Until one day, from the pulpit, in front of the entire congregation, he used his sermon to attack me, to expose me, as if I were a burden in his life. I can still feel the chill that ran through me at that moment. People laughed at some of his phrases, thinking they were mere metaphors or oratorical exaggerations, but I knew they were barbs aimed at me, disguised as a spiritual message. It was as if, in a matter of minutes, my soul was laid bare before everyone, and what should have been a welcoming space became the stage for my humiliation. I remember looking around and seeing the divided gazes. Some suspicious, some laughing, others just silent, as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something broke. The impact of that scene was so profound that, for a few seconds, I felt as if my heart had stopped beating. It was hard to believe that this man, who had once held my hands at the altar and promised care and respect, was now using his spiritual authority to reduce me in front of everyone. Behind the scenes, I was already aware of the petty verbal attacks, the constant silencing, the way my opinions were dismissed. But seeing this exposed in front of the community was a shock that shook every part of my identity. It was as if the hidden truth I'd hidden at home had suddenly been revealed to everyone, but not as a fair denunciation, but rather as a cruel caricature of myself. I became the target of judgments I didn't deserve, and I felt like I'd lost any chance of being seen with dignity. The mindset I'd held until then, that silence was protection, submission was virtue, patience was key, shattered that day. It was impossible not to realize that a line had been crossed, that this wasn't just a detail of marital coexistence. I was faced with a clear revelation. The pulpit had become a weapon, and I, the victim, exposed to collective scorn. Even so, I remained seated, motionless, my gaze fixed on some undefined point, trying not to cry, trying not to show any sign of the pain that coursed through me. Because deep down, I still believed that if I showed strength, perhaps I could preserve the image of the devoted wife everyone expected to see. But this choice cost me dearly, because silence didn't erase the impact of the humiliation. On the contrary, it was precisely from that moment on that the wound began to deepen irreversibly, and nothing would be the same after that day. I felt my heart shatter, as if every word spoken was a knife thrust into my soul. It was as if everyone had stripped me naked there, in front of the church, stripping me of every shred of dignity. I felt naked in a space that should have been one of protection and welcome, but that day became the stage for my shame. I couldn't look up to look at anyone, afraid to see in their faces the silent judgment that already weighed heavily on me. Outwardly, I tried to maintain my composure, but inside, the pain was almost unbearable, as if I had been exposed in a way that could never be undone. The impact of that exposition didn't end when the service ended. In the hallways, the looks were different. Some were mixed with pity, others with distrust, others simply cold. I had the impression that everyone now saw me differently, as if the image he had painted from the pulpit had become an absolute truth. And the cruelest thing was that no one approached to ask how I was. No one dared question if there was something wrong with that speech. The collective silence was deafening. The leadership's image-preserving mindset was stronger than any empathy for me. When I walked home that night, each step felt like a ton. My body was whole, but my identity was in pieces. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. I was no longer just Lisa, Mark's wife. I was the exposed woman, the one carrying public humiliation on her shoulders, as if it were a mark for everyone to see. It was a feeling of imprisonment that suffocated me, because I had nowhere to run, no one to share that wound with. Behind the scenes of my life, the loneliness grew even denser, and it was in that silence that I began to realize how much that scene had changed everything. It wasn't just a misplaced sermon. It wasn't an unfortunate metaphor. It was a watershed moment. It was the revelation of a hidden truth I hadn't wanted to admit. The man who was supposed to protect me was destroying me, and the community that was supposed to sustain me preferred to remain silent. It profoundly affected my mindset, because it made me realize that continuing to live that way would be a path to self-destruction. Still, I didn't have the strength to react immediately. I continued following the rituals, dressing myself with the smile that no longer grew from within, appearing beside him as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, the journey had already changed direction. I knew the decision to keep quiet was slowly killing me, and it was on this fragile terrain, with my soul scarred by the pain of public exposure, that something even more painful was about to happen, pushing me toward an inevitable confrontation with the reality I so feared seeing. The worst part wasn't just what he did, but the silence that echoed louder than any words spoken from that pulpit. No one defended me. No one dared stand up and say it was wrong. The church's silence was like a verdict. If he said it, then it was true. And that silence hurt even more, because it made me feel not only betrayed by him, but abandoned by an entire community I had served my entire life. It was as if my pain had no value, as if my voice had been erased forever. The judgment was against me, not him. People looked at me as if I were responsible for the burden he carried, as if his devoted wife were, in fact, the root of the problems he insinuated to everyone. The mentality of protecting the leader's image was so strong that no one wanted to tarnish the image he had built. It was easier to silence me than to confront him, and this had a devastating impact on me, because I began to believe the lies I was told. I began to think that maybe I really was a burden. Maybe I was to blame for that coldness. Maybe I hadn't been good enough. This was the cruelest part of the entire journey, seeing how hidden truths transformed into distorted narratives, where I was the villain in a story where, in reality, I was the victim. Behind the scenes at the church, whispered comments abounded. Small insinuations, sidelong glances, and flung phrases reached me, reinforcing the feeling that I had been marked. Each Sunday, the space that had once been my spiritual home became a field of judgment. I no longer walked freely through the aisles. I simply passed by, trying not to attract attention, trying not to provoke further speculation. And this spiritual solitude was as suffocating as the pain I carried at home. It was in this context that I realized a stark revelation. It's not enough to believe in faith when the community itself doesn't practice the principles it preaches. I was faced with a painful contradiction between discourse and practice, between proclaimed values and real attitudes. And this shock began to generate a silent transformation within me. I didn't have the courage to act immediately, but my mind began to question. My soul began to rebel against that place of invisibility. And it was in this realm of judgment and silence that I understood something bigger was about to happen. Because when your heart is already broken and your trust is in ruins, any new discovery can become the trigger for a definitive change. And the revelation that would come soon after would further shatter the illusions I was trying to hold on to. When I found myself caught up in this collective silence, I realized how difficult it is to carry a pain that almost no one has the courage to name. And that's exactly why I chose to share my story here, because I know many women experience similar situations but feel they don't have the space to speak out. If this topic resonates with you, if my words somehow awaken something within your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what makes this space grow and reach more people with this kind of content. People who perhaps right now need to hear that they are not alone. Each subscription is a reminder that this conversation matters, that it's worth exposing hidden truths and building a community where vulnerability becomes strength. And it was precisely in the midst of this scenario of abandonment and judgment that I began to realize that my journey could no longer continue along the same path, because there was something even deeper about to be revealed, something that would forever change the way I viewed my marriage and even my own faith. At home, the atmosphere was heavy, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. I walked on eggshells, choosing each word carefully, each gesture cautiously, trying not to provoke arguments that could escalate into storms. I lived with the constant feeling that any misstep could trigger an explosion, and this tension eroded my peace in an almost invisible yet devastating way. The home that should have been a refuge, a space of rest and love, had become a minefield where silence was the only way to survive. I believed there was still time to save our marriage, that if I tried harder, prayed harder, endured more, things could change. It was a mindset that held me captive, that my mission was to hold on tight, even when everything around me was crumbling. But the hidden truth was that I was increasingly alone in this endeavor. He no longer seemed interested in rebuilding anything, only in keeping up appearances in front of the church. Behind the scenes, when the doors closed and the outside world disappeared, all that remained was coldness, indifference, and a deafening silence. This wear and tear wasn't just marital, it was existential. I found myself questioning who I truly was, what remained of the woman who dreamed of building a family based on love and faith. With each day, it seemed my identity was becoming a little more diluted, as if I were slowly being erased in the name of a struggle that no longer made sense. Yet I continued, as if my perseverance alone were enough to hold together a structure that was already crumbling. The impact on my emotions was profound. I became more anxious, more insecure, and sometimes I found myself in front of the mirror, trying to find traces of the woman I once believed could be happy. But instead of answers, I found only the weight of a lonely journey, where each decision seemed to push me further away from myself. And while I insisted on saving what was already falling apart, I didn't realize that the most painful revelation was yet to come, ready to definitively expose the fragility of what I was desperately trying to protect. Until one day, I found messages. It wasn't from another woman, it was from another man. My world collapsed there, in front of a cold screen that revealed conversations charged with intimacy, desires, and secrets I never imagined existed. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to piece together for years finally fell into place. But instead of forming a picture of hope, they revealed a hidden truth that crushed me. The impact was so profound that for a few moments I couldn't breathe. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet and I was falling into an endless void. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the shattering of an entire narrative I had believed, defended, and upheld in front of everyone. The man who preached about holiness, family, and fidelity, who held himself up as an example before the church, was living a parallel life no one could have imagined. The transformation in my perception was instantaneous. All the excuses, all the silences, all the humiliations began to make sense. That marriage I was fighting to save was already corrupted long before I realized it. I felt deceived, used, but above all, invisible. Because, upon discovering those messages, I realized my presence had long since ceased to matter. Behind the scenes, he had already made his choices, and my attempts to maintain the image of a solid home were merely a facade to hide what was really going on. The pain came not just from the infidelity, but from the revelation that I had fought alone for something that never truly existed. And the worst part was knowing that if I tried to speak out, judgment would fall upon me again. I could already hear the voices of the congregation telling me to be patient, to pray more, to expose a leader. The mentality of protecting the institution and his public image was stronger than any compassion for me. So, in that moment, I realized I was stuck with a cruel choice: silence and carry the pain alone, or break away from everything I knew. The revelation of that betrayal was a turning point in my journey. Nothing would be the same from then on. Transformation was no longer a distant possibility, but an urgent necessity, because continuing to live that lie meant giving up my own life. And it was precisely at that point, still in shock and heartbroken, that I began to see that this discovery would be just the beginning of a series of even harsher revelations. I didn't know how to react. Beyond the pain of betrayal, there was the shame that burned inside me, a feeling of being cruelly exposed, even though no one yet knew the truth. What will they say about me? Was the question that hammered in my mind relentlessly. I found myself faced with a seemingly impossible dilemma: remain silent and bear the weight of something that wasn't my fault, or speak out and face the avalanche of judgment that would surely fall upon me. The fear of others' opinions became almost as devastating as the discovery itself. It was as if I had suddenly become a character in a distorted narrative, where any decision I made would be interpreted as weakness or rebellion. If I stayed, they would say I was complicit in sin. If I left, they would say I was the unfaithful wife, incapable of providing for the home. And in the midst of it all, my personal pain seemed unimportant. The hidden truth is that, in an environment where public image is more important than reality, women almost always carry the burden alone. The emotional impact was devastating. I would have crying fits in the silence of the early morning, moments when I could barely look at myself in the mirror. I felt scarred, diminished, as if his betrayal were a testament to my own failure. The guilt mentality followed me every step of the way, reminding me that somehow I might have failed as a wife, as a woman, as a Christian. It was a lie that consumed me, but it seemed to gain strength because I was already too fragile to fight it. And then there was the cruelest part: daily coexistence. Sitting at the table, listening to his voice, pretending to be normal, while inside, I was in pieces. Every gesture, every word of his seemed like a constant reminder of the double life I'd discovered. It was like living in an invisible prison, where the jailer was confused with the person I once called love. It was in this clash of emotions, pain, shame, helplessness, that I began to realize I couldn't continue living like this indefinitely. I needed to make decisions, even if I didn't yet have the strength to act. And this journey of facing head-on what I feared most was just beginning, opening the way for even deeper revelations about myself, about him, and about everything I believed to be unshakable. And again, the judgment fell upon me, as if it were my fault for not being enough, as if I had failed in some invisible way that justified everything that was happening. It was astonishing how those around me could invert the logic of pain. Instead of addressing the gravity of his betrayal, they preferred to point it out to me, as if I hadn't been able to provide for my own household. This cruel mentality crushed me because it wasn't enough to deal with the disappointment at home. I also had to face the external pressure that made me believe I was the source of the problem. Behind the scenes in the community, comments emerged disguised as advice. Phrases like, "Pray more," "Be more patient," "Understand that men are like this," fell on my ears like stones. It was as if each word carried the weight of a veiled accusation. No one wanted to face the hidden truth about him, because it would be much harder to admit that the man so respected in the pulpits was also flawed, also contradictory, and had also made decisions that destroyed trust within our home. The easiest path was to place all the responsibility on me. The impact this had on my emotional journey was devastating. I felt increasingly small, more fragile, as if I were carrying an impossible burden. The revelations about who he truly was had already shattered me, but now it was as if the world around me was helping to maintain the chains that bound me to suffering. I fought against the feeling of invisibility, but at the same time, I absorbed each criticism as if it were a definitive sentence about who I was. And yet, there was a spark within me that refused to be extinguished. A barely perceptible voice that reminded me that I couldn't live forever under a weight that wasn't mine. This voice began to awaken a new mindset, still timid, but pushing me toward an inevitable transformation, because I knew, even if I couldn't yet admit it out loud, that continuing to accept that judgment meant giving up my own life. It was at this point, when shame and guilt seemed to engulf me completely, that loneliness began to become my only companion. And it was within that heavy silence that I realized my journey was about to descend even deeper before I could begin to find a way back to myself. I felt alone, abandoned by him, by the church, by everyone. It was as if I'd been left in a desert, surrounded by voices that judged me, but with no one willing to truly reach out. The silence I found outside my home was the same that accompanied me inside. A heavy silence, full of indifference, as if my pain were invisible. He went about his life as usual, preaching, smiling, maintaining the image everyone expected to see, while I sank deeper and deeper into an abyss of loneliness. Loneliness has a devastating impact because it not only isolates but also distorts. I began to believe the lies that surrounded me, internalizing the idea that perhaps I really was irrelevant, that I had no value. This inferiority mentality became a prison even more cruel than the betrayal itself. I could be among many people in the church, but I felt like a ghost walking the aisles unseen. It was a kind of abandonment that didn't scream, but suffocated in silence. Behind the scenes, I found strength in small things. A solitary prayer, a verse that seemed to speak to me, a moment when tears finally came and brought some relief. But no matter how much I sought solace, the feeling of emptiness persisted. It's difficult to describe what it's like to live knowing that the person who should be your safe haven has become the epicenter of your pain. And even harder is realizing that those who should be by your side choose to walk away, rather than compromise the hidden truth that surrounds all of this. It was in this environment of profound solitude that I began to see my own vulnerability in a new way. I realized I was on a journey that could no longer be postponed, the journey of finding myself, of discovering who I was beyond the title of devoted wife, beyond the image I maintained to please others. It was painful to admit, but transformation could only begin with the recognition of my loneliness. It was like looking in the mirror and facing not only the marks of pain, but also the possibility of a new story. And it was in this state, amidst tears and silence, that something began to blossom. Within me, it wasn't yet strength, nor full courage, but a whisper that told me I couldn't continue living this way. And this whisper would be the starting point for a cry that would change the course of my journey forever. It was in this dark valley that I cried out to God, "Lord, if you don't hold me now, I can't take it." It was dawn, and I was kneeling on the cold bedroom floor, my face wet with tears, without the strength to even form beautiful words. What came out of me was only a silent scream, a cry that came from the depths of my soul, because I knew that, humanly speaking, I had nowhere else to run. It was in that moment of despair that I understood that only God could truly hear me. Only He could see the depth of the wound I carried. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't want theological answers or logical justifications for what was happening. I just wanted to survive the weight of the next day. And it was there, in the midst of my weakness, that I realized something. That changed my mindset. It was no longer about fighting to save the marriage at any cost. It was about fighting not to lose myself. This was the beginning of a silent transformation, an awakening that didn't come with immediate clarity, but as a ray of hope amidst the darkness. Crying out to God that night was like opening a door to something new. I still didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't completely alone. It was as if a gentle voice reminded me that my story didn't end there, that even amidst shame, abandonment, and judgment, there was still purpose to my journey. This revelation didn't eliminate the pain immediately, but it brought the certainty that I had someone to hold on to, that there was a solid rock when everything around me seemed to be crumbling. Behind the scenes, the situation remained the same. He continued with his appearances, the church remained silent, and I still faced the pressure of stares and comments. But inside me, something was beginning to change. The impact of that prayer was subtle, but real. It was as if I had received a spark of courage, small, but enough to remind me that I could take different steps. This decision to cling to God was the turning point that began to realign my mind. As if with each tear I shed, I was cleansing a bit of the lie that had enveloped me. And it was from this cry, this raw and sincere encounter with my faith, that I began to see that my future didn't need to be defined by betrayal, humiliation, or the church's silence. Something new was being born within me, even if I couldn't yet fully understand it. And it was precisely on this fragile but fertile ground that the coming events would confront me even more intensely, and God found me, not in grand miracles that changed everything at once, but in small signs of love that, little by little, rescued me from the abyss. It was in an unexpected message from a friend, in a silent hug from someone who didn't ask for an explanation, in a simple word that seemed handpicked for me. These details, which many might consider trivial, became direct answers to the cry I had made. It was as if he was reminding me that he hadn't left me alone, that there was still hope even when I couldn't see anything beyond the pain. These gestures had a profound impact on my mindset, because until then, I believed that rediscovering my faith would mean seeing something grand, like a thunderous revelation or an instant change. But what I received were discreet seeds, which fell on parched soil and began to germinate slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was in this process that I understood that transformation would not come from the outside in, but would begin within me, from the decision to believe again that I had value, that God still had a story to write through my life. Each day, these small signs helped me lift my head and see that there was so much more beyond judgment and shame. I began to realize that, behind the chaos, there was a journey being built, a journey of restoration that didn't depend on his repentance or the church's recognition, but only on my willingness to let myself be healed. This revelation was liberating because it showed me that I didn't need to wait for ideal circumstances to start over. I could begin now, even broken, even amidst uncertainty. Behind the scenes of my life, there was still pain, still loneliness, and still deep scars, but something inside me was changing. It was as if light suddenly filtered through small cracks, illuminating a space that previously seemed doomed to darkness. This rediscovery of faith didn't erase the past, but it gave me the strength to face it head-on and begin choosing new paths. And it was precisely at that moment, when I was finally beginning to feel the breath of life within me again, that unexpected situations placed me before new revelations, trials that would test not only my strength, but the depth of this faith that was being reborn within me. I understood that I no longer needed to be silenced. For the first time in many years, I felt that my voice mattered, that what I carried within me could no longer remain trapped in silence. It was as if a weight began to lift from my shoulders, and with it came a new clarity. My story also has value. My pain also needs to be heard. Until then, I had lived as if my words were mere dispensable details, as if my function was merely to reinforce his discourse and sustain an image that no longer existed. But now, after everything that had happened, I understood that remaining silent would be allowing the lie to continue to dictate the course of my life. This realization didn't come suddenly. It was a journey. Small signs showed me the power in owning my own words. In discreet conversations with people I trusted, I realized my truth had an impact, that it could touch other lives. It was curious to observe how, when I opened up, those women who listened to me ended up confessing similar pains, situations hidden behind closed doors in their own homes. And I wondered, how many of us carry hidden wounds for fear of judgment? How many believe we don't have the right to speak because we were taught to remain silent? This revelation gave me new courage, because I understood that telling my story wasn't just about me. It was also about giving a voice to so many others who still live imprisoned. My mindset began to shift within me. Before, I'd believed that exposing my pain would be a sign of weakness, but now I realized it was quite the opposite. Opening my mouth was an act of resistance, a way to break the chains that bound me to the past. It was a decision of transformation that could no longer be postponed. I needed to look in the mirror and tell myself, you are not invisible. You are not to blame for what was done to you. You have the right to speak. These words, even spoken silently, began to restore my identity, as if mending pieces I believed were lost forever. Little by little, shame began to give way to something else, a strength that grew each time I dared to express my truth. And it was in this process that I understood that reclaiming my voice was more than a personal choice. It was a mission, because if I remained silent, I would allow the distorted narrative to continue to prevail, and that I could no longer accept. The impact of speaking out was real, even if frightening, because it challenged everything I'd been taught about submission, silence, and keeping up appearances. There was still fear, of course. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of facing the consequences alone. But this fear was no longer enough to paralyze me, because alongside it, something stronger was emerging. The conviction that my voice was a gift from God, not a mistake. This revelation completely changed the way I saw myself, and with each step I took toward freedom, the loneliness seemed to lose some of its strength. And it was precisely at this point in the journey when I finally began to experience the power of listening to myself and allowing myself to be heard, that new decisions had to be made. Decisions that would not only redefine my path, but also challenge everything I believed about marriage, faith, and even myself. Forgiving wasn't easy. In fact, for a long time, I resisted even hearing that word, because it seemed so unfair to use it on someone who had destroyed me inside. How could I forgive someone who used the pulpit to humiliate me? How could I forgive the man who broke our covenant and still made me carry the guilt before the church? The hidden truth is that at first, I confused forgiveness with acceptance, as if forgiving would justify what he did. But I soon understood that wasn't the case. Forgiving, in fact, was freeing myself from the burden of eternally carrying that pain. I needed to shift my mindset to understand that holding on to resentment was like drinking poison, hoping the other person would die. And it was in this revelation that I found the courage to take a different step. The impact of forgiveness wasn't immediate. It didn't come in a single moment, but rather a long and painful process. Each time the memory of the betrayal returned, each time I recalled the humiliation in front of the congregation, I had to choose. Either let myself be consumed by resentment or surrender that wound back into God's hands. It was like relearning to breathe, a daily decision that gradually opened space within me for healing. Forgiveness didn't erase the gravity of what happened, but it broke the chains that kept me trapped in the past. I no longer had to relive the painful scenes as if they were my identity. Little by little, I discovered that I wasn't just the betrayed woman, the humiliated wife, the silenced victim. I was someone in transformation, someone who was reclaiming her voice, rebuilding her journey, and learning to walk again, even with scars. This decision wasn't about him. It was about me, about the freedom I needed to experience to move forward. Behind the scenes, there were still challenges. Some people's gazes remained filled with judgment, and memories insisted on knocking on my door when I least expected it. But forgiveness acted as a shield, not to protect me from the world, but to protect my heart from becoming hostage to hatred. It was in this process that I realized something essential. Forgiveness wasn't an event. It was a journey that taught me, step by step, that healing doesn't come when justice is served, but when we choose not to live trapped by what hurt us. This transformation not only changed the way I viewed the past, but also began to pave the way for future decisions. Because once forgiveness took up space in my heart, I could finally look at myself without carrying the weight of what he had done to me. And it was precisely at this point, when I began to experience true inner freedom, that I realized my next step would be much deeper and would require courage I had never experienced before. Today, I no longer define myself as the betrayed wife. This identity that weighed me down for so long, that seemed to scream louder than any other, no longer belongs to me. I understood that I am not his mistake. I am not the church's silence. I am not the shame they tried to place upon me. I am a beloved daughter of God, restored and in the process of healing. This revelation completely changed the way I see myself and also the way I relate to my past. The wounds still exist, but now they are scars that tell a story of overcoming, no longer a sentence of pain. Getting to this point was an arduous journey, requiring me to reevaluate everything I believed about myself. For a long time, I had a victim mentality, a woman who was humiliated, betrayed, and judged. But over time, I realized that this wasn't my final identity. It was just part of my journey. The transformation began when I realized that if I continued to define myself by pain, I would be trapped in the past forever. I needed to make new choices, resolving each day to rise up as someone who carries value within herself, regardless of what was done to me. It was through this process that I learned that identity isn't built solely with pretty words, but with practical decisions. I needed to learn to look in the mirror and see not the broken woman, but the woman rebuilding herself. I needed to surround myself with people who reminded me of who I truly was, people who, far from the judgmental backstage, saw me as a human being, not a character in a scandal. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on the way I lived my days, because it restored my hope that my life could still flourish, even after the desert I'd traversed. The new identity I assumed wasn't handed to me on a silver platter. It was achieved through tears, through nights of prayer, through silent choices unnoticed. It was through intimate revelations with God that I discovered my worth wasn't in being someone's wife, nor in being recognized by the community, but in being a beloved daughter of the Creator. This truth gave me a freedom I'd never experienced before. It didn't mean denying what happened, but looking at it with a new mindset, seeing the impact of my own journey not as a defeat, but as a testament to resilience. And from this rediscovery of myself, I realized that every pain I experienced could become a source of healing for others. It was as if my story had gained a new purpose, to show that no matter how deep the abyss, there is always a way back to life. And it was precisely when I assumed this new identity that I understood that my journey still had important chapters to be written, chapters that would require courage, firm decisions, and a willingness to fully live the truth that now set me free. If you're experiencing betrayal, humiliation, or abandonment, know that your life doesn't end there. I myself believed for a long time that the end of my marriage would also be the end of my story, that public shame would be an eternal label. But the truth is, when all seems lost, it's often precisely the point at which a new journey begins. It's at rock bottom that we realize there's something stronger sustaining us, something that goes beyond the pain. Transformation doesn't happen when we deny what we feel, but when we have the courage to look at our wounds and decide that they won't define who we are. I know what it's like to feel like no one hears you, that your voice isn't heard, that your pain is invisible to the world. I know what it's like to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you, to believe the lies they repeat that you weren't enough. But I need to tell you, that's not true. The impact they tried to have on your identity has no greater power than the truth of who you really are. And that truth isn't in what they did to you, but in what you choose to do from now on. Understanding this was a revelation that changed my mindset forever. I stopped seeing myself as just a survivor and started seeing myself as someone rebuilding. Because surviving means resisting the weight of the present, but rebuilding yourself means deciding to write the future on new foundations. And when this awareness arrives, you realize you're not condemned to live trapped behind the scenes of a painful story. You can be the author of a new narrative, full of choices that restore your dignity, freedom, and strength. I also know that fear is real. Fear of judgment, fear of loneliness, fear of failing again. But it was precisely at the moment I chose to face these fears head-on that I discovered the courage that had always been within me. This courage didn't come from a single moment, but from small decisions, repeated every day, that gradually added up to become a different life. That's how I understood that starting over doesn't mean erasing the past, but re-signifying its impact, transforming wounds into testimonies and tears into seeds of a new phase. So, if you feel alone today, remember, you are not. There are many women, just like me, who have walked through similar deserts and who can be living proof that there is life after pain. Your voice matters, your journey matters, and what you carry within can become a source of hope for others. The decision not to give up is yours, and it has the power to change not only your trajectory, but also that of many who will observe your transformation. And it is precisely because I know this, because I have experienced firsthand the strength that emerges even after the greatest humiliation, that I want to continue sharing, because there is still something more that needs to be said, something that goes beyond individual pain and touches on a collective revelation. The call for no woman to accept living in silence, hidden behind masks that do not belong to her. I am living proof that it is possible to rise again, even after the worst pain. There is life after betrayal. Even when it seems like everything inside you has been shattered, and you no longer have the strength to carry on. When I look back at all the nights I cried myself to sleep, the days I dragged myself along without energy, the moments I thought I had no purpose left, I realize that the greatest revelation was not his failure, but the strength that was born within me in the midst of this desert. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was built step by step, tear by tear, decision by decision. It's at this point that many people don't believe starting over is possible. I needed to shift my mindset to understand that pain didn't define me, that shame didn't have to be the final word. Yes, there was an impact, and it was profound, but there was also a recovery that can only be explained by grace and courage. I'm not saying it was easy. There were days when everything seemed lost, when the silence was deafening and loneliness crushed me. But it was in those shadows of internal struggle that I discovered who I truly was. And that discovery is worth more than everything I lost. Today, I can look at my scars not as marks of failure, but as signs that I survived, that I resisted, that my journey was not in vain. They remind me that there is a hidden truth in all pain. It can be transformed into fuel for new choices, for new paths. I am proof that no matter how deep the abyss, there is always a way out. And that way out often begins within ourselves, when we decide that we will no longer accept living imprisoned by lies. So, if you're listening to my story now, I want you to know that you can too. You can rise, you can rebuild, you can rewrite your life. No matter what they said about you, no matter the judgment that fell upon your shoulders, no matter the betrayal you suffered, none of it can nullify the value that exists within you. Your voice matters, your pain matters, and most of all, your hope matters. And perhaps that's precisely what the enemy tries to steal most, your hope, because without it, you stop halfway. But when you choose to believe, even if it's just a thread of faith, that thread can be enough to pull you back to life. I believed I'd never be able to truly smile again, but today I know it's possible to smile again, not because everything has been resolved, but because something within me has been restored. And this restoration has given me the courage to live authentically, without fear, without masks. The most beautiful thing about all this is realizing that my story doesn't end in pain. It continues as a testament to resilience, overcoming, and faith. I know there are other women like me who are now silent, believing there is no way out. But I'm here to say, there is. And when you decide to stand up, not only does your life change, but you also become a light for others who need the same new beginning. If this story spoke to your heart, share this video with another woman who needs to hear it. Don't keep to yourself what could be an answer for someone experiencing the same pain in silence. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and let's walk together on this journey of healing and restoration. Because together we are stronger, and every voice that rises breaks the cycle of silence that so often tries to silence us. Your participation here is not just a simple gesture. It is part of a larger movement of transformation. And I want to invite you to stay with me, because there is still so much more we can experience and learn side by side.